Amen. So welcome, and we're doing a large section of the text today. But because they all hang together, they're kind of a part of a flow, and so there we go. There we are. Matthew 25 verses 1 to 30. So we sometimes we do as few as kind of 6 or 7 verses, and today we're doing 30. So there's a lot of verses, but because they're narrative, because they're telling stories, 2 parables, one after the other, you kind of read them at a greater speed, perhaps, and try not to get too dragged down and into the kind of the context of a particular word. So again, to give it its context, because this whole flow of the last few chapters of Matthew, pretty much from Jesus' arrival, which has gone back quite a few months now, but his arrival a few days before Passover, and Matthew has this large amount of information that goes into that period. And so he's taking us on this transition, really, if you like, between the past that was represented by John the Baptist, and a whole new way of doing things, which we're going to see is by faith. Although, as we touched on perhaps in the previous weeks, because my own understanding is that actually I'm not a great fan of breaking things into arbitrary, and forgive me if I use the word arbitrary, but arbitrary dispensations based on because it kind of almost makes it very capricious of God. I'll choose to save people by getting this formula correct on this occasion, this formula. For me, you look at it and say at the heart of it has always been about a revelation of Jesus, regarding how much revelation you actually have. So Abraham has faith in something that God is going to do in providing of a sacrifice. That's something of the revelation of Jesus. So anyway, we're in a real transition, because if we are going to draw any dispensational point, it's in the cross, because something is going to actually spiritually and physically and in creation change with the cross and the resurrection. And so this flow, which all of the Gospels cover in more detail than the rest of the life of Jesus, Matthew in particular puts an emphasis on this week, and we're coming to the end of this week. So the transition into what is to come is in focus. And of course, Jesus has framed things with what's to come right at the end. The ends of the age, the destruction of the temple, which is not necessarily the end of both ages, but it's the end of one age, the beginning of another, the end of a second age. All of these things that we've been looking at in the apocalyptic sermon have become backdrop to now how Jesus is going to start to spell out something of the dynamics of faith, which is not passive, as we're going to see. It's active in the parables that we're going to look at. So we start then with the parable we often refer to as wise and foolish virgins. I've gone for the translation of bridesmaids simply because that's the kind of context. It's not every young girl who's there at the wedding. It's those who've been specifically appointed to be part of the entourage that welcomes the groom to the wedding. So then the kingdom of heavens could be compared to 10 bridesmaids. Now remember, most of Jesus' ministry, he's been saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. You'll see that the kingdom is coming amongst you. And he's been, if you like, prototyping it on behalf of those who are going to continue the process of bringing heaven onto earth. That's why it's the beginning of the prayer as we pray it. So the kingdom of the heavens in the plural, because Matthew sometimes puts, when he's using in the plural, it's probably because Jesus is speaking and as an Aramaic speaker. The Aramaic word for heaven is in the plural. Occasionally Matthew puts it into the singular because he's probably commentating at that point in the Greek. So that's a tiny little technical point. Some of you remember we've covered that in the past. But the kingdom of heavens could be compared to 10 bridesmaids who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. So they're participating in their role within the kind of the wedding preparation. But because it's such a celebration, weddings often have a sort of unlike in kind of UK, British, Western weddings now, you have to be precisely at the chapel on exactly the right time. Otherwise you're in trouble. The first wedding I ever actually took for somebody was because the minister got the time wrong. He was actually in Tesco's at the time when the wedding was supposed to be happening. And British UK law required that actually we had to do it there and then. It wasn't going to be it would be a big headache if we were to postpone it, because you have the registrar and so on. So I talked to the registrar and ended up doing it. In Eastern weddings, and it's still true in parts of the world today, there's much more of an excitement, and part of that excitement is a little bit of ambiguity. We sort of know roughly the day, but we're not quite sure when the bridegroom is going to turn up. Sometimes we just know a handful of days. There's all of these sorts of things. And so they're in the place where they're preparing to meet the bridegroom. It's going to be a celebration at night, so there's going to be lights involved. So we need to have lamps with us ready for when the bridegroom comes. So Jesus kind of prepares it. 5 of them were careless and 5 were mindful. We often put foolish and wise. But actually, the words are the most natural translation of the second word there is thoughtful, and the careless or regardless or heedless is the kind of translation of the first. So I think it's not that they're thick; it's just that their kind of character is such that they're in this situation. It's providing a contrast between those who, if you like, live in the moment and those who are thinking ahead. So the careless, having taken their lamps, took no extra oil with them. But the mindful ones took oil in flasks along with their lamps. So we know the story well, of course. And when the bridegroom took his time, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. So we're getting the kind of the impression that's probably on this occasion, the wedding that Jesus is referring to, they do know the day. That's going to be a phrase that is repeated later on. We'll come to that. They do know the day. The sun has set. They're still waiting, and so presumably, therefore, those they've all actually been burning their oil lamps because it is dark. But their expectation is he comes quickly as it gets darker. It's harder to stay awake. Just in kind of context, although. The ancient world actually does very often will stay awake very, very late, because particularly in the heat of the day, across that middle band of southern Asia, Europe, into the Middle East and down to the top of Africa. Of course, the sun is extremely hot midday, so often people have slept during midday, so they will stay awake until they wake up in the evenings and can stay awake quite late. But for whatever reason, he really is hanging on. He's taking his time, and so they fall asleep because they're drowsy. And then in the middle of the night, there's a commotion. Look, the bridegroom is here. Come out to meet him. And then all the bridesmaids got up and primed their lamps. But the careless one said to the mindful, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." So at the point they've fallen asleep, presumably they've put the lamps out. But now, how long are those things going to last? But the mindful answered and said, "No, what if there isn't enough for us?" Sorry, I should have gone back to the previous slide. In the middle of the night, there was a commotion. It talks about a cry out, or a kind of a commotion is the way I put it. There were various words you could actually kind of play around with there, but there's a kind of a sense of almost the bridegroom's entourage is moving, and news of him is going ahead, and so we become aware that he's close and approaching. Perhaps he can be seen in the distance with his own lamps and torches. So the careless one said to the mindful, "Give us some of your oil." But the mindful answered and said, "No, what if there isn't enough for us and for you? Instead, go to the peddlers and buy for yourselves." Although it's a slight aside, it's one of these. I actually find this quite helpful. This little verse. The words of Jesus are really core. I think I've said this in the last couple of weeks, and I'm thinking about it a lot because I'm doing it as a teaching theme within King's Church. But Jesus kind of marks the beginning of discipleship as, if you abide in my words, then you really are my disciples. You say, and then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So discipleship starts by taking time, abiding in his words. And the way Jesus teaches is not so much, here is a rule for all time and all eternity. It's much more, here is some words that illustrate a principle which you need to take time over and understand them in terms of how you internalize them. And then, Jesus gives these 3 marks of discipleship, which finish with, if you abide in me and my words now abide in you. So we've started the discipleship process by listening to the things that Jesus says. And he then goes on to say, in this you will bear much fruit and so glorify my Father and prove to be my disciples. The proof of discipleship, that's in John 15, is that those words are now into us. They've got into us. And so we don't live by law, which is, Jesus said this, it's a new law. So, for instance, Jesus says, give to him who asks. This is where I'm going with it. Give to him who asks. Is that a new law? Well, you'll be very quickly broke at that rate. I remember first reading that as a teenager and feeling challenged by it, wanted to take it seriously. And so people would come up, and when I'd go on trains or whatever, there's normally someone there who's asking for something, for money. And I would want to, as a kind of spiritual religious principle, always have something to give them. I won't kind of go into the stories. I have literally lost hundreds of pounds that way. Now, I'm not now saying I've got cynical about these things, but actually you read a verse like this. Actually, it's not inappropriate sometimes when someone who asks for something. You're not trying to keep this as a law, but you're understanding that what Jesus was looking for is a readiness in the heart as you've taken time over it and you've interpreted, but you qualify it with other verses like this. No, there isn't enough for us and you. This is a prudent way of doing things. This is an endorsed approach or response in Jesus's parable. So I take those things on myself, and you think, okay, so I balance that principle of I want to give to him who asks, but equally there is this kind of a sense of responsibility, and actually the response can be sometimes educational, it can lift them up and so on. Instead, go to the peddlers and buy for yourselves. So that's just a kind of a personal way of that. How do we, me trying to explain that process of we hear a word. It's not just something for the head and the law to keep, to either succeed or fail to, but it's something to have meditated on, take it seriously, look at how it qualifies, how does it fit, how does it reflect in my own life, balanced in with other things that Jesus has said, and eventually his word abides in us, and we bring all these things together in the mix. But anyway, for those who have been careless, so while they're on their way to buy it, the bridegroom arrived, and those who were ready went in to him to the wedding feast, and the door was closed. So later the other bridesmaids arrived too, saying, Lord, Lord, open up for us. But he replied, really, I tell you, I don't recognize you at all. The phraseology there, it's often it's the no, is we translate I don't know you. I put the at all because it's quite emphatic, and also it's in the perfect part. It's past and perfect tense. The actual no there, so it's kind of it's I really don't get you. It's not just that I don't know you at this point, but it's perfect. But it's actually I've never really you're not the person I thought I knew. Almost is the sense there. So stay alert, because you don't know, let alone the hour when the Son of Man is coming. So it can sound harsh, and if we read these words, which some do, as if you like, were we prepared enough and did we make it into heaven by our works? That's not really what Jesus is driving at. But he is talking about the exercise of faith, which we'll see very clearly when he joins this with another parable we all know is about faith, which is the parable of the talents, and how do we respond to those. So here, what it's really we have is we know we have been invited by faith into the privilege of awaiting Jesus' return and the culmination of the kingdom that we've been waiting for and that we've been working for. And Jesus starts by illustrating it with a parable that shows there is something about the way we look at these things and how we carry them carefully and consideredly. And that's the word he uses, the wise virgins. The word for wise is mindful. It's taking heed of, it's thinking about. The careless are not foolish in a kind of a moral sense. They're just careless. And the problem is that carelessness can often lead to missed opportunities and even things where we don't have what we need to do something that's really, really important. And while we hear the words of the master as sounding quite harsh because they've missed the opportunity, but in a limited space, if you're not there and everybody's crowding in, then you are stuck outside of the door in outer darkness. He doesn't use that word directly just yet, I don't think. Hang on, is it? No, it's not. He uses it at the end of the second parable when he talks about outer darkness. But the idea really is of it's not that you now are damned for eternity. It's just you're not enjoying the party. There's a party going on. There's a celebration going on. And that celebration is something that actually your carelessness in this case means you're not enjoying. And to go back and put it the way we were starting is in its context, this is in this transition period from how Jesus has modelled something into how the church is now going to carry on that mission. And something about that, even for those who were invited in, just as it was that not all of Israel were actually going to be there not all Israel is actually elect. Some of those who are known by the name of Jesus, but he never knew them. He's already said that in the past, and so on. So stay alert, because you don't know the day, let alone the hour. The bridesmaids here knew the day. They lit their wicks at the beginning of the night, but they didn't know quite how long it was going to be before the guy got there. You don't know the day, let alone the hour, when the Son of Man is coming. Again, if you look back, we were thinking the other week about Jesus commending the wise steward, the wise administrator of his responsibility, and we use that word therapii, from which we get therapy from. that actually a wise one is doing it in its time, it's doing it in its season. There is a process, and there is a consideredness, and there is a kind of a place of planning. And so there is an element of faith, so I want to put it, that is best seen in taking seriously the commission we've been given. And so that's often a part of the way I try and encourage people from a developmental point of view, is to try and understand what is it that God has said to you to do. So what are you doing today that is preparing you for what he's going to do with you in the future? Again, I don't want to spill the beans on any individual in particular, but you'd be surprised how many people I've met who have the sense that the Lord told them that he wanted them to make lots of money. I don't say that they always qualify it for the kingdom. So then you say, so what are you doing about that then? Well, I don't know. The Lord's going to do that. Okay, now you can't force those things to happen. I can't just decide today I'm going to make lots of money. But actually, I can put down skills and I do those things. One of the things I regularly try and I do find is a very helpful thing is particularly if you're in a situation where people are asking you for developmental help in something, is to get them to focus on what the Lord's actually asked them to do, and to think about what are you doing today that is preparation for when you need to do that. I always remember a man I met who felt the Lord was going to lead him to a place where he was dealing with top business people and politicians. So as a young man, he took up golf. That was an act of faith, if you like, in preparation. If I'm going to meet these people, if that's who the Lord's saying I'm going to be, he wasn't himself going to be either a businessman nor a politician. He felt the Lord had given him something to speak into those kinds of people. So he thought, what's the skill that they do? How do they often have conversations? They do them over golf. It's that response, if you like. He is like the wise virgin who's got enough oil to last the whole course. You can also tie it, obviously, in more general things to the gospel, like preparing the costs before you start building a tower and so on. But I just wanted to draw out that as Jesus talks about faith into the new season, he starts with preparedness, which certainly when I was a younger person, I didn't get at all as a young Christian. The bit that I got was much more what comes next. So, because now Jesus contrasts, and he kind of ties in the way he kind of says, for just like. So what he's just said about preparedness, he now balances. It's not like end of story, new story. This is all about the tension of faith. There's an element of preparing and planning, but there's also an element of risk taking. And so Jesus is going to give us the parable of the talents. For like a man going on a long journey, he called his personal servants and entrusted them with his assets. Now, this is probably the most famous of Jesus' reward parables. Remember there was the workers who go out and work different lengths of time in the day and get paid all the same. There's another one where people get given a smaller amount of money, and they're kind of in a slightly more even kind of process. This one here though has a particular kind of contrast to it. The amounts that we're dealing with, that they're entrusted with, are enormous. They're multi-million pounds worth of value, which is why I think that you will often see the really or genuinely that I've got in verse 15 there is at the beginning of the sentence, but I thought I'd put it, and to the one he genuinely gave 5 talents. It's literally where it sits. In other words, I'm not making this up when I say this story. I've told you stories in the past where people get paid a few pennies. I've told you stories where they get paid kind of a normal living wage, but now I'm telling you a story about millions of pounds. So to give it a contrast, the entire tax burden in first century Judea was about 6,000 talents. So 6,000 is a lot, it's more than 5. But if you think about the tax burden in the UK, or say Wales or somewhere, we're talking multiple millions of pounds when we're talking about 5 talents worth of gold. So he was genuinely given 5 talents, and then to the next 2, and to the next 1. So straight away there's a contrast here. Almost that word genuinely draws attention to it, which is what you've been entrusted with. And what we're in the process, as I step out of the picture, this is Jesus speaking, as I step out of the picture and now is entrusted to the stewards, those who followed me, the apostles, the wider level of disciples, the groups of women that he is going to apostle by sending them deliberately with the message. All of these different groups, the 500 in one place who see the resurrected Jesus, the 120 in the upper room, the 3,000 who get filled with the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost. All of these people are being drawn into something, and in different ways they are all being given an absolutely enormous resource. And to each, but it's not that we all get the same. It's enormous for all of us, the things that we have available, but to each we've been given a particular resource from the Lord, to each according to his ability, and he left the region immediately. So we got the 5, got the 2, and then we got the next one. He gets 1. So the one who'd received 5 talents went and worked with them, and he made 5 more. Likewise, the one with 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who had received the 1, he went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. So after a long time, the master of those servants came back to settle accounts with them. And again, it's interesting to note here, because remember, we've just left behind the apocalyptic sermon where we've had questions about ends of ages, second coming. Well, they don't think of it as second coming yet. They haven't called it that. But coming again, coming of the kingdom, those sort of things. And one of the things we see very clearly in the writings of the early church is there was an expectation of the quick return of Jesus. But here he's telling 2 parables right there in the Gospels, just as we're in the cusp of that transition into he's been once, we're waiting for the next thing, and both with the wise and foolish virgins, or the careless and the prudent, no, careless and mindful. That's where I translated it. Careless and mindful bridesmaids. There was a delay that the bridegroom seemed to be taking his time coming, and now actually the master is gone for a very long time. That length of time actually has a kind of an interesting kind of play in it, doesn't it? Because you can imagine if someone goes and says, here's some money, and you think, I'll just stick it in a corner and won't do anything with it. That works if they come back 5 weeks later. If they come back 5 years later, interest would have made a difference, which of course is what comes into play. So after a long time, the master of those servants came back to settle accounts with them. And he who received the 5 talents came and presented another 5, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I've gained 5 more. And his master replied, Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over small things. I'll put you in charge of many things. I juggled with this for a while. one is a kind of a diminutive, and the other is a kind of a sense of more. So it could have said more things, but more things, just that could be a few more. So many things, where that probably does mean a lot, because I think that's the flow of it. So which case then I thought to myself, should I put lesser things? But then lesser could just be relatively, whereas I think the idea is they were small. So they were small, now you've got a lot. So there's something about the way in which you took risks in my absence, which means that you've proved yourselves to be trustworthy with the lot, the huge amount, the huge resource that you've been given. And so in actual fact, you found that what you had responsibility over has grown. I always, one of my, don't know why it's a favourite quote, but from Einstein, I think it's because it's so incongruous to what you'd think he'd said. He was once asked what the most remarkable thing in mathematics or science he was aware of, and he replied with the word compound interest. But actually that's the way interest works. It compounds, that actually you do it when there's only a little and there's a little bit more and there's a little bit more, and then suddenly it's suddenly multiplying. It's suddenly got really large. So that you are faithful in those small things, you'll be put in charge of many things, because as he kind of gets return on the small, he's got more to do bigger things with and bigger projects with the next time. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had 2 talents also came and said, Master, you entrusted me with 2. See, I've gained 2 more. His master replied, Well done, good and faithful servant. You're faithful over the small things. I'll put you in charge of the many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And it's actually the pleasure of the master that they have done well. And that's an important thing for us to kind of take on board. Because often, again, I used to find as a younger person, I focused on, if you like, the response to the one who doesn't do so well. But for those who are doing well, there is great joy for Jesus, great joy for the master. The one who'd received 1 talent also came and said, Master, starts the same. I knew that you're a hard man, reaping where you've not sown, gathering what you've not scattered, and I was afraid. I think this is one of the points where the verse break has been put in an unhelpful place. I think the I was afraid kind of fits nicely for me at the end of the of verse 24. So having left, I hid your talent in the ground. So there's an admission, if you like, that there is something of fear in place here. Now, there's an interesting verse in Revelation where it talks about those who are being judged, and it talks about the cowards, and you hear people who get very upset. They're saying, well, why is being a coward a moral issue? If you're afraid of something, you're afraid of something, But there is an element to which Jesus does seem to put fear as something that actually we shouldn't be entertaining. Now, I'm not saying that in a simplistic way, because I understand totally why people feel fear in lots of situations. But there is this dynamic of perfect love casts out all fear. There is a kind of a challenge when I'm fearful. How do I respond? I look to find the love of God. I look to engage with it, to look for Him to give me the strength to overcome that fear, rather than resting in that place. You cannot, as it's been pointed out before, you can't be courageous if you haven't actually dealt with the fear. So there is something about, we want to take on board that living in fear is not an excuse, because actually the resource contains within it the ability for us to find a connection with God that gives us an opportunity to behave in ways that aren't reflective of that fear. So having left, I hid your talents in the ground. So look at this. You have what's yours. Big win. Here it is. I've given it back to you. I've kept it safe, and there it is. But his master answered him, wicked and lazy servant. You knew that I reap where I did not sow, and I gather from where I did not scatter. So you ought to have deposited my money at least with the banks. There we go. There's a spelling mistake. I said I hadn't had a chance to proofread that, Colin. That on my return. I would have received back my own, but now with interest. Take appropriately. It's that weird little word that's stuck in there in the Greek. I've gone with sometimes they have just indeed or whatever, but it's kind of almost taking account of what we've just heard. There are those who've traded and done well. There are those who've just sat on what they've got and done nothing with it. So take appropriately the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. And that always used to feel really unfair to me. But actually, when you're in a franchise business, it's actually a standard practice, if I can put it that way. So franchise business are as long as you stick within the kind of the rules of how you do it, you've got an incredible freedom to grow and do those sorts of things. But within those franchise contexts, what I've discovered is that the wisdom in business terms is that actually you tend to keep on investing in those that produce the most return. Whereas if you invest on those who aren't doing so well, it might seem kind to them, but actually the franchise goes under very quickly. So Jesus is kind of almost spelling out that this is the way the system will work. Why? Because we have huge amount of resource. God has been incredibly gracious with it, and he's asked us to do something with it. And when we look around and we see others doing better than us, it's not an excuse to say I'm fearful because they're doing so well and I'm not. So I'll just be faithful with and hold and return what you've got. Somehow or other, we've got to learn by resting in the provision and the love of God that casts out the fear, to behave in faith with ways that are appropriate to who I am and reflect what he's already seen and gifted me with and the talents I have. And effectively trade or do work with those. And then Jesus uses this phrase, which I think he uses about 4 times in Matthew. It's why it's sometimes referred to as the Matthew principle, as a shorthand way of describing what's called the Pareto distribution, or there's some other titles. There's been observed several times in sociology. To everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But from him who doesn't have, even what he does have will be taken away. And as I say, this is in mathematics, we could talk about the Pareto distribution, which is that very often you find that it's very small increments, but when they're acted on well, they create a much bigger disparity in terms of the reward that comes in, which is on the whole why what sounds so gracious when we're talking in terms of economics, of we want to level everybody to the same level, actually doesn't work, because actually we level each other down. It's better to allow, it doesn't mean to say that it is unrestricted and not taxed or other things. It's better to allow people to reap the rewards of their activity, because it inspires them to do more, and it leaves an incentive for others to be inspired and kind of grow as well. And so, as I say, this whole kind of principle is sometimes referred to as the Matthew principle, because it appears 4 times in the Gospel of Matthew, which is that there is something that very often we're kind of trained from young children, because it's kind to share, but being kind to share when it's imposed on you is not your kindness. It's a kind of cultural norm and expectation. And as a cultural norm and expectation, it's often not good for those who are benefiting by not actually learning to stretch their faith or take the risks or do what they could do, because if we added our abilities into the mix, the whole lot would do better. So, and then it finishes with the final verse, and throw that worthless servant into the outer darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And again, we're kind of now paralleling with the wise and foolish bridesmaids. Those who got there late couldn't get in because the door was shut. Because actually there are only so many people who can get into where the party is really happening. So it's not an eternal statement of judgment. It's not about going to heaven or going to hell, but it is about the process of the kingdom that is being handed over at this stage to the disciples. That those who will get most out of it are those who take what God has given them, focus on that and try and use it and grow it. Because actually, while it will grow in its own way, which is a good win, there is also a principle in which they end up getting given more. We just had that verse. Yes, take appropriately the talent from him, i.e. the one who doesn't use it, and give it to him who has 10 talents. And so actually, as we learn to act in faith and take risks of faith, which risks that don't mean an excuse to be shoddy with faith and not plan with faith, which was the first parable, actually there is a natural reward in its own right, but actually there is also from heaven, if you like, from a heavenly perspective, there is a sense in which you're getting given things that may have gone to others, but they're just not using them, and so the Lord passes them on to you, which in a strange way, I say in a strange way, what may feel like totally the inappropriateness of scale, is what happens with the nation of Israel and the church. But Paul talks about it like that. So what they had is now, we've been grafted into what they had, but actually if they refine themselves, they can get grafted back in themselves. But actually there's a kind of provocation, which Paul writes about in Romans 10, that he would make them jealous by a people who weren't even a nation, that the nation of Israel is being made jealous by the success and the flourishing of the gospel through the church, which is not a kind of a total replacement, but it is a provocation towards something in the old covenant, if I put it that way. So there you go. We've taken 40 minutes. Did anyone like to ask any questions or make any comments? And we've just looked at